let's go to discussing those sorts of details, Lisa, because it's certainly my sense that people are increasingly willing to have this sort of conversation, I think, and yet some of the details can certainly put up significant roadblocks and obstacles for people, particularly as you mentioned, people as consumers we don't necessarily do our homework, yeah? And I think typically the time that we're engaged in thinking about this is at the very stressful and vulnerable time of having had somebody that we love die. And now we need to make these arrangements, yeah?
Yes. Kind of an interesting aside, before Byron had done his work, Jan Berman on Martha's Vineyard wanted to, her mother died at home, and Jan wanted to drive her body to the little cemetery there. And the hospice nurse was absolutely convinced this was illegal and swiped the death certificate.
Oh, geez.
And gave it to a funeral director. So we really have to educate not just consumers, and hospitals have been a terrible problem to a body to a family. They'll release an infant, a live infant, to parents who have never been trained in parenting. But they worry for some reason about releasing a body to the family.
Right. Well, and let's talk about those details, because as I say, my sense is that dealing with those details are things that could keep people from doing something that they may otherwise really later feel, oh, that would have been, that was a wonderful experience. Even if it was difficult, it was a good experience for us to go through. And the details, you know certainly better than I, but it's about a death certificate, right? It's about a transporting and disposition permit, which needs to be gotten if one is to do a home burial. It's plans for burial or cremation and disposition of the ashes that need to be made. And is embalming essential? Is that required? If you could, just lay out, obviously there's loads of information there, and certainly interested people would be directed to the websites I know you'll speak to, the books that you've written, but lay out in broad strokes the what sorts of things need to be done when in the course of events.
Well, in the case of an anticipated death, such as a hospice death, be sure to walk through the process ahead of time to let the hospice people know what you plan to do, let the doctor know what you plan to do, let the town clerk know what you plan to do. And that will alleviate a lot of the problems. It's a little more difficult if it's an unexpected death. If it's an unexpected death, then a medical examiner needs to be involved. But again, the medical examiner may not know you have this right, and you may have to educate the medical examiner. So the death certificate, I don't know whether Massachusetts is yet on electronic death registration, which is happening in most states. But you can usually use a paper death certificate and walk that through.
And you get signatures. And you get that from the doctor who
the
comes?
Doctor or the hospital.
Okay, all right. So there's that death certificate, and then there's
once you have the death certificate, the town clerk will issue the burial transit permit, disposition permit.
All right.
If you're choosing cremation, you need a medical examiner's permit to cremate. As well. If you have rural land, then burial on your own land might be permissible. But the town health officer will have to approve it. Bill Cosby buried his son Enos on his property there in Massachusetts.
All right. But urban, suburban areas like Arlington, not going to have the ability to do that, I gather.
Probably not.
Okay. All right.
But you have small town cemeteries that aren't too expensive.
Okay. All right. Disposition of ashes.
You can do anything you want with ashes.
Okay.
With the landowner's permission.
Right.
The
Okay.
EPA, some funeral directors will say the EPA has all kinds of regulations. Well, that's just not true. What the EPA says is that you may scatter cremated remains in the ocean 3 miles out, but that's only because the states control 3 miles in.
Right.
California is the only state that has any regulation within the 3 miles.
Okay.
And that's that you have to be at least 50 or 500 feet from shore. Okay. And you can't scatter them from a bridge.
Okay.
But that's the only state.
Okay.
If you are traveling with cremated remains, they should not be in a metal container. It should be maybe in the cardboard box that comes from the crematory, so it will go through the scanner.
Okay.
And if you're shipping cremated remains, UPS and FedEx will not knowingly accept cremated remains, but priority mail, there's a special priority mail category.
There's an irony to that, of course.
Yep.
Okay. All right. Embalming, I think the general belief would be that if a body is going to be kept for viewing, then it absolutely needs to be embalmed. Not so, I read in your book.
Not so.
Okay.
The funeral director will push embalming because if they can pretty up the body, they can probably sell you a more expensive casket.
Interesting.
But there is no public health purpose served by embalming whatsoever.
Right.
Temperature has more to do with decomposition than the time elapsed after death.
Okay.
At 70 degrees or less, the body is going to be fine for 2 or 3 days.
Okay.
Before there might be a smell problem.
Right.
But a smell problem is just a nose problem, not a health problem.
Gotcha.